Our next panel member, next speaker, is Kimberly Elsbach. Kim is Associate Dean, Professor of Organizational Behavior, and Stephen G. Newberry Endowed Chair in Leadership at the UC Davis Graduate School of Management. Kim's research focuses on the acquisition and maintenance of organizational images, amongst other things. She studies organizational identity, reputation management, especially images related to legitimacy, trustworthiness, and creativity. Kim?
Okay. There we go. Okay. Does this work? Yes? Yes, it does. Okay, so I'm going to focus on one aspect of organizational perception, and that's organizational identity, because I've done most of my research in that area. And Amber's presentation, which was fabulous, really hit home for me, because what I'm looking at is organizations trying to get you to know them, and they're competing with all of this other stuff. There's a lot of connection between these two presentations. So organizational identity is just a perception of who we are and what we do as organizations. And if you look at these logos of major organizations, right away, some sort of descriptors come to mind in terms of who we are and what we do. And that is the identity of the organization, the thing that comes to mind that's on the sort of tip of your mind in terms of the organization and what it stands for. Not always what the organization would like you to believe it stands for, but identity is a reality. It's not something that is always intentional. Why should we care about identity? Well, we know there's a lot of research that positive, distinctive, authentic organizational identities are important for attracting loyal customers, employees, investors, supporters of all kinds. If we perceive our organization positively, we are more likely to be committed to it. That's why it hurt so much a few years ago when the major perception of UC Davis was embodied in a picture of pepper spraying. That because of that connection we have to the organization, we want to see it positively. Negative identities then can threaten our self-esteem and threaten our support. But ambiguous identities can be even worse. They can attract a lot of people, but they can create a lot of uncertainty about what you stand for, who you are, and what you do, and lead people to not know whether or not they should connect to you. How do we form perceptions of organizational identity? This is a very simple answer, and there's a lot of psychologists here. I usually don't have psychologists, and so this may just seem really obvious, but it's categorizations. So that's how we form perceptions. What are the categories that we put organizations into? And those categories depend on a lot of different things. They depend on status or status rankings or perceptions of prestige or eliteness. In fact, 90% of the empirical research on organizational identity shows that the primary predictor of identification with an organization is the level of perceived external prestige. So how prestigious or elite the organization is seen is a very strong predictor of whether or not we'll connect with it. But there's some other categorizations that also matter. And in fact, most of the research that I've done over my career has been looking at these other predictors. So while we've paid a great deal of attention to prestige, there are other reasons people connect to organizations. And in fact, that's sort of the sort of point of my research, is that we're not all just looking to connect to a prestigious organization to enhance our self-esteem. There's other things we get out of connecting to organizations, which is actually good news because, by definition, there can only be a few at the top. And so if there's no other reason to connect, the rest of the organizations out there are in big trouble. So some of the things that we also connect with: distinctiveness, authentic values, and then also things like routine experiences and labels. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those. So as I said, just to start the story, status, prestige, this is the primary predictor of organizational identification and why people perceive or how people perceive organizations. It's through these status categorizations. And this matters because we get a lot of information from the news, from media outlets about status. We're constantly ranking organizations, we're constantly reporting on their status. And this is a good thing when things are going well. The problem comes when things don't go well, when those rankings are threatened, when there's evidence that that ranking is in fact, maybe wrong. So recent evidence at UNC of academic fraud related to athletics has been really hard for faculty and students at UNC, which had perceived themselves as pretty high caliber, pretty high status. So status is important. When we think of organizations, one of the first things we think about in terms of their identity is, are they top tier? Are they middle tier? Are they lower tier? That's kind of one of the ways we think of who they are. And if we think of them as top tier or rising, then we're more likely to identify with them. Interesting things about, and I'll talk about later about how we can manage this, is, of course, top tier depends on how you slice the pie, right? So you can be top tier locally, but not nationally or internationally. So there are different ways that you can create high status. But status isn't everything. So as it turns out, distinctiveness is also very important, whether or not that distinctiveness is high status. One of the studies I did was on Porsche, the sports car manufacturer, and what happened when they introduced their SUV, the Cayenne, in 2002. Now, since it's come out, people have sort of recategorized the Cayenne as maybe not an SUV. But when Porsche first announced that they were going to, this venerable sports car company that only made two models, the Boxster and the 911, both sports cars, that they were going to make an SUV, there was rioting in the streets. This is not what we think of as Porsche drivers. I love some of these quotes from Porsche drivers and people who are members of the Porsche Auto Club of America. There can be no vision more heretical to a testosterone-poisoned 911 owner than that of a suburban mother loading groceries into the back of her Porsche after dropping her children off at soccer practice. People who have no interest in driving sports cars will be able to describe themselves as Porsche owners. That is not who I am, and I don't want to be associated with them. Every SUV I've seen is driven by some soccer mom on her cell phone. I hate these people. And that Porsche would throw me into that category made me speechless. So the notion of distinctiveness, and of course you might say in this case Porsche is high status as well, but for these people it was more about we're a sports car company. We're not a general auto manufacturer like GM and Ford. And this was, it was very threatening to these people, and it threatened the identity that they had of the organization. Another thing that, aside from status, that matters is values. And sometimes values cannot be put in a status ranking, but values are important because besides needs for status or self-esteem and needs for distinctiveness, people have what we call a need for authenticity, a need to exhibit and express their true self. So I have done a 5-year study of NASCAR fans, and that's me with Clint Boyer when he used to drive for Cheerios, trying to understand why people identify with an organization that is widely perceived to be low status, even by loyal fans. So I interviewed I surveyed over 2,000 fans from the NASCAR Fan Council, and they all rated NASCAR relatively low on prestige. Yet they identified strongly. And the reason was because of values, that NASCAR represented for them some values that were important to them, and their ability to express those values was important to feeling authentic. So it wasn't just self-esteem, and it wasn't just distinctiveness, it was this notion of being true to who I really am. I'm going to see if I can do this. Okay. Wait, how do I, can you help me? Now what did I do? Yeah. And then, there we go.
Play. You just hit it. Should I play?
Yeah, just play.
America, it's time for a gut check. If the founding fathers saw us huddled in our little cocoons, texting each other smiley faces, they'd hang their powdered wigs in shame. When our idea of danger is eating gluten, there's trouble afoot. Yes, we the people have gotten soft, and all the likes in the world aren't gonna save us now. But one thing will.
Welcome to the place where we speed all day, where we bump and grind in a non-sexual way, where scores are settled and we break the rules, and everybody's got a set of badass tools. Get some NASCAR in your life.
Hello, glory, goodbye, strife.
Welcome to the place that we call home, where meats are grilled and you can bring your own, where everyone's welcome and we all belong. Even my friend in his American flag thong.
Get some NASCAR in your life.
Hug your kids and kiss your wife. You want Billy and Sally to learn about math and science? Send them to the school of NASCAR. They'll thank you for it. Sure, everybody in NASCAR gets a trophy as long as they win the race. Did you know that less than 10 miles from Sonoma Raceway you can go wine tasting? True story.
NASCAR in your life. Snap some butter on your knife.
Welcome to the place where your beast is free, like the rubber hooves of a tire stampede, where men and women compete together, just like they did back in the 18-nevers. 200 miles per freaking hour, 700 freaking horse freaking power.
Neck and neck, they're battling down this last stretch. Off from it takes Harvick for the checkered flag.
There's Harvick, Logano, and Hamlin and Newman. Keselowski, Dale Jr., they're all superhuman. Jeff Gordon, Carl Edwards, Matt Kenseth, the Bushes, and maybe Jimmy Johnson will come back and kick some tuchus. Hello, glory. Goodbye, strife. You've got NASCAR.
NASCAR makes its triumph.
Okay. Thank you, Rick. Okay, so based on that just 2.5-minute introduction, what would you say some of the values are that define the NASCAR identity? Anyone? Manly, masculine, yes, that's very much there. What else? Family, yeah. Fun. America. Patriotism. And in fact, in the research that I've done on NASCAR, it turns out that patriotism is the primary value that people identify with because it's something that they can't or they don't feel they have many opportunities, unless you're in the military, to openly express and to show an authentic side of themselves, except for at NASCAR. So people identify with NASCAR despite it being low status because it allows them to express patriotism, to be their authentic selves while they're around other NASCAR fans and while they're interacting with NASCAR. So values are also important. Now, one of the things that's interesting, though, and psychologists, of course, know this, is that it's not just these motives that we have that affect our categorizations. So we're driven by motives for self-esteem, distinctiveness, and authenticity to see organizations in specific ways. But it turns out that we're also driven by a routine experience. And even if we want to see our organizations positively, because that reflects back on us, if we encounter negative things about them on a routine basis, that will start to be part of how we see them. So, and psychologists know this, if you experience something over and over again with your organization, it becomes chronically accessible in your mind. It may be brought to mind without a motive, without even conscious awareness, and you start to see your organization as having traits or categories that, that may not be things that satisfy any individual motives. We did a study of our own graduate school of management, and we found that Nicole, our former dean, is here. She can probably attest to this. We found that the category of resource poor was very common as an identifying category for our school. This was before we were in the new building. So, but that category came up not because people didn't identify, not because they didn't feel good about being part of the school, not because they didn't want to be part of the school, but because they countered it on a routine basis and it became part of their everyday experience. So even if we want to try and create identities that are positive for people, their routine experience can override that. The last thing is when there's a new organization in a new or emerging industry, sometimes we don't have routine experiences. There isn't a routine yet, and the identity of the organization isn't quite yet developed. And in these situations, we look very much to industry labels. Labels allow us to compare an organization to similar others and to put it in a category with like others. Recently doing a study of the new industry of service design, and nobody really knows what this is, but it's a combination of service and design. And so people think of it as some kind of consulting service organization that uses design principles. And in fact, that's what it is. But so people either perceive of it as a consulting firm or as a design firm. They don't know how to put them together, and so the label gives them hints about where to categorize the organization. So the general finding from all this research is that perceptions are formed or shaped by categories, and that these categories, which categories we use, are driven by our individual needs and motives, and also on our everyday experience. So you might have a model that looks something like this, where you have these predictors, which are individual motives, experience or lack of experience, leading to some common categorizations that then tell us what the organization is about. And that then leads to the question of how can we manage identity perceptions knowing this? Is that a picture of my book cover? How did that get in there? Okay, so there are some ways that we can influence these perceptions. One is we can influence everyday experience. We can influence status categories that are available, what people know about. What people know about distinctiveness. We can allow people to be authentic and express their authenticity, and we can obviously choose labels that say what we want. I'm just going to give you 3 examples from some of the research that I've done on these kinds of tactics. So, status categories. I did a study of business school rankings. When Business Week came out with their very first rankings of business schools in 1988, a bunch of this was the first time the media had sort of ranked these schools in a very flashy, bold, attention-getting way, as Amber would say, and they had turned the rankings upside down. Instead of just saying, well, who do we normally think of as the top business school, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Chicago, they asked students, graduates, and recruiters what they thought the best business schools were. And because they collected data in a completely different way, the rankings were turned on their heads, and schools that never were on top were, I think Kellogg at Northwestern was number 1, Harvard was down at number 5. It turned everything topsy-turvy, and schools that had thought in their own minds that they were top tier all of a sudden weren't. And so what did they do to manage this? They deliberately, in their own backyard, recategorized themselves using other ways of slicing the pie. So at the University of Texas, for example, they weren't even in the top 20 in the first ranking that came out, and they had consistently thought of or talked about themselves as an elite school. What they did is they put a full media push on trying to create the sense that, well, we're still top tier, just in our region. So they said things like this: we're considered the best in our region, like Michigan, which is very powerful, and is also of national stature with Stanford, Harvard, and Wharton. So that's how we'd like to be seen, a school that totally dominates a region and yet is not known only as a regional school. So they recategorize themselves. Yes, we're still elite, it's just in a smaller group, smaller pond. Value categorizations. What happens when organizations want to create a sense that we have a certain set of core values that should define us, and others aren't sort of getting that? One of the things that I've studied in this area is physical design, physical markers. So some of this can be, we talk a lot about media and what we say, but a lot of what we do physically in terms of building, decor, those kinds of things actually say a lot about who we are. So I've done a lot of study about physical markers and what they say about values for organizations, and it's actually quite fascinating. People really, one thing that I love is this notion of wood. If you have wood in your reception area, people think of you as innovative, energetic, and comfortable. So here's Google over here with the wood and the funky seating, and of course Google's innovative, energetic, and comfortable. And then no wood, rigid, unpleasant, and impersonal. I don't know what organization this is, but nobody wants to be there, clearly. So something as simple as the decor or the presence or absence of wood can create a perception of your values and what you value. Last is everyday experience. So we talked about this often is something we don't think about. You encounter routine events every day and they shape what you think, even if the organization is spending a lot of time saying, we're number one, but if every day you encounter the drinking fountain that doesn't work and the door that's broken, you get a different perception. I did a study of routine experiences with hospital billing departments, somebody you really want to interact with on a routine basis, and found that they actually, in how they treated their patients from the billing department, created strong impressions of the hospital's identity, from accommodating, legitimate, to intimidating and bureaucratic. And this is a quote from one of the billing staff members that I interviewed, and they said, I'm supposed to take steps to prevent patients from going up the ladder with complaints. I'm not allowed to give out an administrator's phone number. I just connect them with another representative, which is just, now I get it, okay? They're clearly trying to give you the impression that you're not going to get anywhere. You're just going to go around and around. And this hospital was seen as very bureaucratic. So the way that you set up these routine experiences can create an identity impression. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up by saying, identities are important to organizations because they attract and maintain identifiers, supporters, employees, customers, alumni, and that's important to us as organizations, and that those identities rely on how we categorize the organization, which may be influenced by our individual motives, but also by our everyday experience. and understanding these influences and can help us to help our organizations to put their best face forward and help them to attract and maintain supporters. That's it. Thanks.